This video was approved by the Comics Code Authority. For a comic book to be approved by the Comics Code Authority, it had to follow all of these rules, or else it could not have a stamp in the front and it would not be sold in stores. We will talk about how these rules changed comic books later, but first you need to stop right there as we talk about the beginning of comics, the Golden Age. The first issue of Action Comics in June 1938 was a huge act in comic books and the Golden Age because it was the first superhero debut introducing Superman. Less than a year later, Detective Comics came out with issue number 27 in May 1939 featuring Batman. The Golden Age of Comics. This lasted from 1938 to the early 50s. In 1947, the first issue of Eerie Comics came out. Many people believe that Eerie Comics created the horror genre that started to have many other comic book series, which caused the beginning of the Comics Code Authority. The beginning of Comics Code Authority. How it started. The Comics Magazine Association of America, or CMAA for short, decided that in September 1954, there should be a stamp on each cover of a comic book. In order for that comic book to get the CCA stamp, or the Comics Code Authority stamp, it had to obey each and every rule. If they followed the rule, they could be sold in stores. This prevented children from buying horror comic books. The CMAA believed that this would be better for children everywhere. Many people, however, believe that the only reason the Comics Magazine Association of America enforced this new rule was because of a new book in 1954 titled Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Werdum. Frederick Werdum was a child psychologist that thought comics were running to a child's brain. He didn't want children to buy these type of books. He wrote a book to inform parents how bad comic books really are. The CMAA must have been scared of getting in trouble. So instead, they decided to make a Comics Code Authority rule. Now, back onto the rules. All of the rules are important and you need to follow all of them to have the stamp. But we think that there are 5 rules that you should know. And here are the 5 important rules of the Comics Code Authority. 1. Crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. This simply means they can't feel bad for the criminal and think what he is doing is right. It also says they shouldn't do what the criminal is doing. It also can't persuade someone to not like or disagree with the law. 2. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. This rule is to prevent children from getting scared and being traumatized for the rest of their life. 3. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. What this rule is saying is that comics can only have bad people if it shows that what the bad person is doing is wrong, and to not do what they are doing. The second part states that evil cannot say anything or do anything that can hurt someone's feelings. 4. No comics magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. This is a simple but important rule. If this is to protect horror, then it shouldn't have a horror title, even if, for example, it says Horror No More. This helps notify children that the comic book is safe. 5. The last and probably most important rule. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Even though this protects children in believing superheroes always win, it is very controversial. This is the reason why the Joker loses against Batman. This is the reason why Loki loses against Thor. Because of the Comics Code Authority, comic books with a CCA stamp always had a superhero as a winner and a villain as a loser. So there it was. Starting September 1954, every comic book cover needed to have a little stamp or seal on the top right corner just so it could be sold in stores. Some comic book companies like Marvel, Bongo, DC, and Archie didn't even really need to change anything and weren't affected with this change at all. 14 years after the Comics Code Authority, new types of comic books came out. These are called underground comics. Underground comics are comic books that are relevant or feature satire in them. None of these follow the rules of the Comics Code Authority, hence the name underground. Underground comics started in 1968. Some people have said that there is one man who is supposed to be the father of underground comics, and that man is Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb started writing and creating comic books in 1968. He is the creator of a very famous underground comics company called Zap Comics. Zap Comics is a very satirical type of underground comics. It was never intended to be approved by the CCA or Comics Code Authority, as Mr. Natural himself said, the whole world is completely insane. Yep. Angel Food McSpade is another Zap Comics character. In her picture, it says, she's all heart. And she replies, the rest of me ain't bad either. Angel Food is always naked, so she is clearly not approved by the Comics Code Authority. Fritz the Cat is another R. Crumb character. This shows how much Robert Crumb truly inspired to start the underground comics wagon and the horror story wagon. Travel a few years later and stop at the 1980s. The Comics Magazine Association of America, or CMAA, has become less strict about the CCA, or the Comics Code Authority. They started allowing more violence and they would still put the seal on the cover. It's now the early 2000s and people are starting to not give a hoot about the CCA. Comic book publishers stopped sending comic books to be approved. Marvel, Bongo, DC, and Archie were the last major comic books to still carry the seal. They carried it for so long due to the fact that they were going to get approved anyways. In 2001, Marvel decided to leave the seal because there was no longer any use to have it. Bongo did the same thing in 2010. In January 2011, DC and Archie both dropped the seal. Archie was the last to drop the seal, and after that, the seal was retired and all the rights of the seal now belongs to the Comic Book League Defense Fund. So as of January 2011, the seal is dropped and no longer in use.